Today's daf we're going to be learning is Kiddushin daf samachet. Today's daf is sponsored by Hannah Petrikowski. Thank you to Michelle's consistent learning in the first weeks of war, despite everything, praying for our soldiers, captives, and those injured. Okay, there's a study guide for today, which will help you organize a few charts. Not the typical back and forth, but I did do a few charts, which will help organize some of what we're going to be learning. Okay, we started our question yesterday, toward the end of yesterday's daf, which was, how do we know that ein Kiddushin tovsim b'chai ve'lavim? Remember, these things seem to go together. If there's no Kiddushin, then the child is going to be a mamzer also. Okay, so how do we know that the child, if we remember, the third case in the Mishnah was anything that she can't marry him, but she can marry other people, which means basically forbidden relative relationships, then we're going to say ein Kiddushin tovsim, and meaning there is no valid betrothal, and the child is going to be a mamzer. So now the Gemara wanted to know, where do we get this from? The first answer was, right after a while of back and forth, they finally conclude, well, by achot isha, if somebody marries their wife's sister, it says, okay, I'll read you the whole pasuk. We didn't read it yesterday, and it's on the sheet for today, on the first chart. Isha el achota lo tikach litzror legalot ervata aleha bechayeha. Which means you cannot betroth a woman's sister, okay? And it says, lo tikach. That means, lo tikach means you can't betroth her, which means even if you try to betroth her, there's no valid betrothal. Then we said, well, maybe it just means you shouldn't do it, but if you do it, it's valid. And then they learned from, remember, the woman who gets divorced from her husband and goes and marries someone else, means someone else, but not a relative. And that's going to exclude, that's going to say, even if she did it anyway, it's not going to be a valid betrothal. So between the combination of the two, we learned it's true for achot isha, there's no valid betrothal. Then they want to learn from there to every other case. So the first way we tried to do that was to say just logically, right? We're going to basically say, well, this is erva, there's karev, if you do it on purpose, if you do it accidentally, you bring a sacrifice. In any case, we're going to say it's like all the others and everything else is like this, okay? But then we said, no, there's a problem because there's two that are not exactly that way. There's two that are a little bit more lenient to a certain extent, which is the achot isha, the eshet ach, marrying your brother's, right? The brother, you marry your brother's wife, a man marries his brother's wife. Well, there is a heter for that one in the mitzvah of yibum. And eshet ish, a married woman, once he divorces her, it's permitted. So those are arayot, which actually have some sort of heter, which means those are a little bit more, there's a leniency to them. So if there's a leniency, then maybe we would say, maybe Kiddushin are tovsim if someone betroths a married woman. We know it's not true. Or a man betroths his brother's wife when there's no chiyuv of yibum. So they basically reject learning it from logic. Instead, they say, we are going to take it from achot isha, and this is where we ended yesterday. Ella, I'll read back from 4 lines from the bottom. Ella amar Rabbi Yoda v'itemer Rav Huna b'reid Rabbi Yeshua amar kra. Kol asher yaseh michol hatoivot ha'ela v'nichretu. Anyone who does any of these arayot will get karev. Hukshu kol arayot kulam la'achot isha. So what do we learn from here? All the arayot are the same. If they're all the same, well, achot isha, we know ein Kiddushin tovsim. No betrothal is going to, right? If you do a betrothal, it's basically nothing. And the child's going to be a mamzer. Likewise, we'll learn for all the others. And that seems very logical. So, and very not logical. This sounds like a good argument. Instead of using logic, which we had some problems with, because again, if we use it as a paradigm, just because logic would state we could use it as a paradigm, we have a bit of a problem because there are two that are a little more lenient than all the others. But if we say this pasuk compares them all, it says they're all the same. Well, once we know achot isha, this is true for, we can learn to all the others. So not based on logic, based on a pasuk. Well, that sounds very nice, but we have a problem with this. Ihachi, starting out at the top of our daf, afbilu nidda nami. Well, who's listed in the arayot? A woman who's in nidda. A woman who's in nidda. Now, let's say you get married while the woman is in nidda. So there's a wedding, there's a betrothal, the woman's in nidda. Now, right now, they're forbidden to have relations. So you might think ain't Kiddushin tovsim, but the fact is Kiddushin are tovsim. Okay, and we're going to see that right now. Amar Abai, hakol modin b'bala nidda v'ala sota she'en avla mamzel. So if a man is to marry a woman while she's in nidda, which you might say in Kiddushin tovsim, if you say in Kiddushin tovsim and then they have relations after, like let's say she gets out of nidda, they have relations, they have a child, maybe the child will be a mamzer. And the fact is, Abai says there's no way the child's a mamzer. And we know we have this type of thing. It's called a chupat nidda. There's certain things you have to do when the woman's in nidda, but there is definitely a betrothal. There's no problem with him betrothing and marrying the woman when she's in nidda. There's some technical problems you have to deal with, but the fact is that the Kiddushin is valid. Now, why is this relevant? Well, a nidda is listed in that, is listed in the list of arayot. And how do we know the Kiddushin or Tovsim in the nidda? Now, it's also in a sota. That's irrelevant for our purposes. It just happened to be quoted with Abaye. Okay, but let's just go again. So what does it mean, the sota? It means if a man accused his wife of being a sota, they're not allowed to have relations anymore until they figure out whether she was really a sota or not. So if in that time period where it's a suffix, whether she was with another man or not, he's not allowed to sleep with her. But basically, if he does and they have a child, the child's not a mom's. Okay, so both of what this really shows, though, is that in nidda, Kiddushin or Tovsim, how do we get this from? Amar Chizki, Amar Kra, Vatehi nidata alav. There's a pasuk that talks about a man who sleeps with a woman when she's in nidda. It says, Vatehi nidata alav, which basically, the simple reading of that pasuk is that he becomes tameh like a nidda is tameh, and it's talking about laws of impurity. But because he uses the word Vatehi, Tehi is the lashon of Havaya, and Havaya we always associate with marriage. And we're going to see this today in some other pasukim as well. When it says tihiyeh, it means there's havaya, it means there's marriage. So it means that if he betroths her when she's in nidda, the betrothal is actually valid. So now, afilu b'shat nidata teheba havaya. Even if he does the marriage or the betrothal during the time she's in nidda, it still works. So now we're going to say, if that's the case, so we should, okay, if you're going to learn from achot isha to all the arayot, then you're going to learn from the nidda that she's also Kiddushin or not Tovsim. And then it says, so why did Abaye say, Hakol modim b'ba'al nidda she'en avlav mamzer? To which they answer, because there's a special drasha about nidda. So we wanted to say that if we're going to learn from Achot Isha, we should learn to the nidda, and that doesn't make sense in terms of Abaye's pasuk. We say, okay, nidda is an exception. Why is nidda an exception? Because it says specifically, Vatihi nidda ta'ala. So that means even if betrothal happens when she's in nidda, the betrothal is going to be valid. It's an exception to the rule. Okay, so very simple. We have a rule, achot isha. We have a pasuk, right? We have two pasukim that show by her, one lechatchila, one b'diavad, right? One ideally, and then even post facto, if they did it, still not kiddushin. From v'nichritu, right? This pasuk. Anyone who does all these toivot, which means they're all one and the same, we're going to learn that it's true for all the other arayot, also in kiddushin tovsim. From there, we say, what about the nidda? There's a unique pasuk by the nidda, which takes her out of the whole group. But now the Gemara says a very smart question, which is, but wait a minute. Basically, we had one example where the pasuk told us in Kiddushin Tovsim. That was Achot Isha. We have one pasuk by nidda, which says Kiddushin are Tovsim. Now, both of them are listed in the Arayot section. And then we have this one pasuk which says the law for all of them is the same. So, since theoretically you could have said they're all like the nidda, instead of saying they're all like the wife's sister, right? In other words, the wife's sister, there's no valid betrothal, and then we said, okay, well that means by all the rest, betrothal doesn't, right? There's no betrothal doesn't take place. But for all intents and purposes, we could have learned it from the nidda. We have one pasuk for that one and one pasuk for that one. They each teaches the opposite. Why are we going to use Achot Isha as the paradigm? Why don't we use nidda as the paradigm? And then we would have said that all the other arayot, Kiddushin or Tovsim, like the nidda. So la'akusha means to make a hekesh, which is we're going to learn one from the other, right? The juxtaposition. It's not exactly a hekesh here. It's this one pasuk which combine them all together. But basically, they're going to say, "My chazit demachshale la'achot isha, achshale nidda." So why did why did they make the comparison to achot isha? They could have made it to nidda. To which they're going to answer very simply, "Kula v'chumar l'chumar makshin." If you have a choice of one that's more stringent and one that's more lenient, you're going to go the stringent way, which is, if you say in Kiddushin Tovsim, what does that mean? It means the child is a mamzer. So basically, they're going to say, if you have a choice to go with the Achot Isha, which is going to say the law and all the other forbidden relations is more strict, rather than saying it's like nidda, where it's more lenient, we're going to go with Achot Isha. And that's the answer the Gemara gives. However, because it's not the most satisfying answer, right? Theoretically, you could have said, we don't want to be marbeh mamzerim b'Yisrael. We don't want to have more mamzerim, so let's go lekula. So Rav Acha Bar Yaakov is going to bring a different explanation. So we've had so far two explanations. What is the source for in Kiddushin Tovsim by Arayot. Both the first two answers were learned out from a Achot Isha. One by logical inference. Once we have it there, we can learn it by all the others. We rejected logic because of those two exceptions to the rule, which were more lenient. And therefore, we want to learn it in a case where we're going to apply across the board. And therefore, we learn it from that last pasuk, which combines them all together. There still was one exception, which is the nidda, and that there's a separate pasuk to learn. We said, well, then why don't we use nidda as the paradigm? Well, that's because nidda is lekula. Better to go lechumra than lekula. Now, Rav Acha Bar Yaakov is going to give a totally different explanation, not having to do with Achot Isha. We're not going to learn it from there because of all the problems that we raised so far about it. Let's learn it from a yevama. What's a yevama? It's a woman whose husband died without children. She's supposed to marry the brother or do chalitza with him until such time that she does it. The pasuk says, "Lo tiye esha tamei tachutza leish zal." The woman who's left here is not allowed to marry a strange man, which basically means someone who's not her brother, her husband's brother. Okay, she has to take care of yibum first. What if she does? So what if she goes and marries someone else without taking care of yibum or chalitza? So we're going to see now, ma yevama she belav. So first of all, it's only a lo tase. It doesn't say she gets karet or mitapetin. They don't get killed. It's not like the arayot. Okay, it's much less severe. Okay, much less strict. It's only a lo tase, which would mean she would get lashes, let's say. But we're going to learn now that lo tase ba kiddushin. This happens to be a machloket in Masechet Yevamot, whether or not Kiddushin or Tovsim. But if Mrs., the woman whose husband died without children, goes and marries somebody else and doesn't take care of Yibum or Chalitza, what happens? Well, the betrothal to the other guy, according to Rav, okay, again, there's a machloket, but Rav Acha Bar Yaakov is obviously going according to Rav, it's not a valid Kiddushin. She's not actually betrothed him at all because she's forbidden to now, even though it's only a lo ta'aseh. Where did he get this from? So let's go back to the pasuk that I quoted. Lo tiyeh esha tamei tachutza leish zar. What root is there? Tihiyeh. Remember what we said? Havaya is? It's Kiddushin. Lo tiyeh means there won't be Kiddushin. Okay, not just, right, the simple meaning is it means don't go do it. But lo tiyeh means ein Kiddushin tovsim. That's how Rav learns it. So, like I said, there's a machloket about this. Okay, some people say Kiddushin are tovsim. It would be a valid marriage. But Rav says no. And Rav Acha says the following. Well, let's learn it from a kal v'chomer from yevama. It's very obvious how the kal v'chomer is going to go. If yevama, which is only a lav, and there's no Kiddushin, chayve mito b'chayve klitut lo koshaken. So all the more so, if it's a much more severe sin, which is all the ones that you get death by the court or death by God, of course, they're not going to be Kiddushin Tovsim either. Because again, Kiddushin Tovsim means the child's a mamzer. So if the child's going to be a mamzer, if she's a yevama who marries someone who's not her, the relative, well, then obviously someone who's done something much worse, because they get death by the court or death by God, all the more so should not, right? The child should be a mamzer and in Kiddushin Tovsim. So that's third way of learning it, not from Achot Isha, the way the first two did. Again, one was logic, one was based on the pasuk, but all learned from Achot Isha. The third is let's learn from the yevama. So now they have a big question then. If you're going to learn it from the yevama, why don't you say that this builds a paradigm in all chayve lavim, also in Kiddushin Tovsim? What if chayve lavim, right? What did we say in the Mishnah? Remember, let's go back to the Mishnah. We had all sorts of cases where there's avera, right? And then sorry, I just want to find the Mishnah. I'll leave it inside. Makom sheyesh kiddushin v'yesh avera avlad olech achar pagum, right? The almana lekohen gadol, grusha v'chalutza lekohen idiot, netina mamzer, and all that. L'Yisrael, ba Yisrael the mamzer l'netin. So what did we say? Yesh kiddushin v'yesh avera. These are all chayve lavim. There is kiddushin. Kiddushin is valid. So why wouldn't we say if the yevama, we have a pasuk that says in kiddushin, why don't we use it as a paradigm, not just to learn things that are more severe? Why don't we learn from there to things that are on the same level? All chayve lavim. So ihachi shar chayve lavim nami. You should also say all chayve lavim should be also no kiddushin tovsim. Amar Papa, what are you talking about? Chayve lavim behedik tibu. If you remember, chayve lavim splits up into two kind of basic categories. One is isurim for the kohen. Okay, kohen grusha, kohen gadol almana, all those. And the other is mamzer, nitin, and all those. Okay? Now, Amar Papa, chayve lavim behedik tibu. there's a special pasuk, which you might be surprised by, because it's probably not the way you understood this pasuk until now. But from a special pasuk, or a particular pasuk, we're going to learn that ein chiyuvim tosim in all other chayvei lavim. Only the yevama, because we have a special pasuk there that shows there's no kiddushin. But by all other, I hope I didn't say this the reverse, so now I'm correcting it if I did. All other chayvei lavim, there will be kiddushin, like a kohen to an almana, a kohen gadol to an almana, a kohen to a divorcee, right? Or a mamzer and a Yisrael. All those, there is a valid betrothal. The betrothal is considered a valid betrothal. So now, they say the following. Where do we get it from? Well, it says so in the pasuk. Very interesting psukim we talked about before in Devarim, where it says, if a man is married to two women, one he loves and one he doesn't, he can't decide to take the child of the one he loves, who happens not to be the older one, and give him the double portion. So now they want to know the following. Right? We would say it's subjective. They're saying it seems to be objective. There's a beloved wife and there's a hated wife. Who is she hated in the eyes of? Well, Ella, right? Ahuva and Snu'ah before God. It must be something objective. There's one woman who God loves and one woman who God hates. Again, it's not the simple reading of that pasuk. So they say there is no such thing. How would God love one person and hate another person? Ella ahuva b'nisueha. In other words, again, the real thing, they're using God here as their example, but what they're saying is there's an objective concept here. So what's the objective beloved and hated? Ahuva b'nisueha. She's beloved in her marriage because she has a valid, good marriage. Snu'ah b'nisueha. What does it mean hated? Hated in this marriage means that she married someone who she's forbidden to marry. Now, this means, why is she forbidden to marry them? From a lo taseh, from a negative commandment. Now, how do we know that the Kiddushin is valid then? It's, what they basically do is they define Snu'ah as she married someone she wasn't allowed to marry, a regular lo taseh. Now, how do we know the marriage is valid? Because the Torah is describing a situation, Kama Rachmana ki tihiyena. Again, Havaya means marriage. The marriage is valid. And it says when a man has two wives, which means they're both his wives, the Kiddushin was valid, but one of them is Snu'ah. Why is she Snu'ah? Because he wasn't supposed to marry her. Isur lo taseh. So from there, what do we learn? Kiddushin or tovsim b'chayvei lavim. There's only one exception, the yevama, and that's the exception where we're going to learn from there to all other things that are more severe from there, but we're not going to learn to things that are the same because we have a special pasuk that says ki tiyena isha Snu'ah. There is havaya, there is a betrothal, even in a hated woman. What's a hated woman? A woman who did something wrong and married someone she wasn't supposed to marry. Okay? So, which, for example, she could be a mamzeret who married Israel. She could be a widow who married a kohen gadol. Okay? All of those possibilities. But now we're basically working with this pasuk. Ki tiyena isha Snu'ah. There is kiddushin for a woman who does something wrong. What kind of wrong? A lo taseh, we assume, because we know ein kiddushin tovsim by kritu, because we already learned that. So it must be talking about something lower, which is just chayvei lav. To which the Gemara says, what about Rabbi Akiva? Remember Rabbi Akiva's approach. Rabbi Akiva damar ein kiddushin tovsim b'chayvei lavim. He has a very strict approach. His approach is even all those lo tasehs, although we'll see which ones and which not. But let's say mamzer, nitin, kohen, all the isurei kehuna. In Kiddushin Tovsim, he thinks there is no valid Kiddushin, which also means the kids are mamzerim. Okay, that's Rabbi Akiva's big Kiddush. He has a lot more mamzerim than we would otherwise. He says, "Ein Kiddushin Tovsim b'chayvei lavim." So ki tiyena b'may mokim. What's he going to do with that ki tiyena pasuk? We're now off on a tangent. We basically resolved. Okay, again, what do? We brought a third explanation. I'm going to learn it from Yevama to all our rayot that Ein Kiddushin Tovsim and then the vlad's a mamzer, child's mamzer. Then we're going to say, wait. Why don't we learn from that to all chayvei lavim? Because of the special pasuk ki tiyena. But if you think the kiddushin aren't tovsim b'chayvei lavim like Rabbi Akiva, what are you going to do with that pasuk? And for this, we're going to have a bunch of different possible answers because you might remember we just learned this that there's a bunch of different opinions about what Rabbi Akiva actually held. So we're going to have to answer it according to each one. The Rabbi Akiva damar. So again, Rabbi Akiva said, "Ein kiddushin tovsim b'chayvei lavim ki tiyena b'may mukim." What are you going to do with this pasuk ki tiyena? Again, the obvious answer could have been they just don't darshan this because it's a very weird drasha in this pasuk, but they accept this drasha and therefore have to explain it according to Rabbi Akiva. You might remember as I've been setting this up already, there's two types of chayve lavim. One is all the forbidden relationships for kohanim, and one is the mamzer, nitin, and all the people who are not allowed to marry in with the people. So we can separate between them. When Rabbi Akiva said, "Ein Kiddushin tovsim b'chayve lavim," he was only talking about the mamzer, nitin in that category, but not the isurei kehuna. So that's Rabbi Simai, and the way Rabbi Simai explains it, and then it's very simple. Ki tiyena Kiddushin or tovsim. Where is that? In the chayve lavim of the kohanim. Okay, they bring the example of Amanah l'Kohen Gadol, but they really mean all the psulei kehuna, like a divorcee and a Kohen. And how do we know this? They bring up the Amanah l'Kohen Gadol because that's where they actually darshan it from. Titanya Rabbi Simai Omer, min hakol ya Rabbi Akiva oseh mamzer, chutz me Amanah l'Kohen Gadol, other than the Amanah l'Kohen Gadol, and they're going to prove it from a pasuk by their peers there. But again, most commentaries think this means all the psulei kehuna. Sha'arei amra Torah lo yechalel. What's going to happen? The Torah says, if you do this, your child will be a halal. Now, if we say Ein Kiddushin tovsim like Rabbi Akiva, then we're going to say the Vlad's a mamzer. And here they say it's only chilulim oseh, ve'en oseh mamzeru. The Vlad's not a mamzer, which is going to basically mean then Rabbi Akiva was not referring to this category. That's Rabbi Simai's explanation of Rabbi Akiva. And then what do we have? And this is in the sheet. According to this, the pasuk ki tiyena, according to Rabbi Akiva, means Kiddushin or tovsim. In what case? Not all chayve lavim, but yes, the ones that relate to a kohen. Ula Rabbi Yeshevav, but Rabbi Yeshevav thinks that Rabbi Akiva was more all-encompassing, and he even included the Amanah l'Kohen Gadol and all the other isurei kehuna, that Ein Kiddushin tovsim, the Vlad's a mamzer, in which case you can't say this pasuk is referring to them. So the Rabbi Yeshevav Damar, he said, Bo v'nitzaveach al Akiva ben Yosef, let's kind of cry out against him. Shahaya Omer, Kol she'en lo bi'av Yisrael avav mamzer. He wanted to make any kind of forbidden relationship, the child be a mamzer. So, if you remember, we had two ways of understanding Rabbi Yeshevav. If he was just disagreeing with Rabbi Simai and he was relating to what he said, and he said, well, I think Rabbi Akiva includes more, then we have an easy answer. You could say, Shapir, it works better. Why? Because you say, okay, we have levels. What are the levels? Let's just start it again. We have mito beitin and kritud. Then we have lavim, which are less serious. Then we have chayve aseh. Like, for example, you can't marry an Egyptian convert, first or second generation. How do we know this? It never says in the Torah you can't. What does it say in the Torah? You can marry dor shlishi. You can marry the third generation of an Egyptian convert. So what does that teach you? That you can't marry the first and second, but it never says in the Torah you can't. So it's not a chayve lavim, it's called a chayve aseh. It means there's a positive commandment, which means you can marry a third generation, which implies that you can't marry a first and second, but it never says no, you can't. So it's not a chayve lavim. So if Rabbi Yeshevav is responding to Rabbi Simai, then he's saying, I'm going to take you one step farther. I'm not going to take you 5 steps farther. I'm going to take you one step farther, which means you thought that there's a split between the chayve lavim of the kohanim ones and the other ones. I'm going to say that Rabbi Akiva even included the kohanim ones, but he didn't include chayve aseh. And then we can explain it very nicely. And then ki tiyena, what's this isha snua? For example, a man who married a second generation or a first generation Egyptian convert. And that would be a chayve aseh. And then Rabbi Akiva would agree that ki tiyena, there is havaya, their kiddushin are valid. But if he wasn't responding to Rabbi Simai, but he was just saying, Rabbi Akiva held, right? He said it, Akiva ben Yosef. But he says it, Rabbi Akiva held that any kind of relationship that's not permitted, which would then include all the chayve aseh, and he wasn't responding to someone else, he was just saying a blanket statement out of the blue, which means it applies even to chayve aseh, then really, b'may mokim lavim. What are we going to say? Ki tiyena echat snua. Where is there going to be Kiddushin tovsim with a forbidden relationship, even if it's just an aseh? It's not going to be valid. So how's Rabbi Akiva going to explain that? If that's really what Rabbi Akiva held, bi'ula l'kohen gadol. We're going to find one case, and we'll see in a second why that's different. According to the Torah, a kohen gadol can only marry a virgin. So if he marries a woman who's not a virgin, that's also chayve aseh, but it's chayve aseh that's going to be different than all the rest, and Kiddushin will be valid. Maishna, why is this different from all the others? Mishum dehavile aseh she'en shaveh bakol. Because it's a unique mitzvah aseh, which is not applicable to everybody. Meaning, most chayve aseh, like, mitzri, an Egyptian convert can't marry any Jewish man. This woman who's already have relations with some other man, and is no longer a virgin, she is only not allowed to marry one person in the world, the Kohen Gadol. So that's a very unique, it's not something that's an Isur that's on everybody. So therefore, we're going to say that's the only exception to the rule. That's what Rabbi Akiva, according to the second explanation of Rabbi Yeshivav, that is where Rabbi Akiva is going to say Kitiyena, Kiddushin or Tovsim for this case. Because it's such a unique case, it's not included with all the rest. Okay, now we go back to the rabbis and we say, V'Rabbanan, what motivated, now that we just explained, the Kitiyena, the Chatznuah, right, the one who's hated must mean, right, it could mean, according to Rabbi Akiva, can't mean Chai Ve'Lavim, either it means all the Isurei Kuna, which are different, or it means Kiddushin or Tovs and Chai Ve'aseh, or it means just the B'Gulal the Kohen Gadol. Why didn't the rabbis explain this? The rabbis said, this applies to all Chai Ve'Lavim. What? And that's their source, because it says Kitiyena Chatznuah. Why is she Snuah? Because she did a forbidden marriage. What kind of forbidden marriage? Chai Ve'Lavim. But why didn't the rabbis explain it like we just explained to Rabbi Akiva, that maybe it's more limiting, and maybe really in Kiddushin Tovsim and Chai Ve'Lavim? Like, where did the rabbis, why didn't they want to explain the pasuk the way that Rabbi Akiva just explained the pasuk, the way we gave three possible explanations of Rabbi Akiva? So they answer, right? So the rabbis, again, this is the Gemara talking in the rabbis' words, but the rabbis could theoretically say, you want to say this pasuk refers to a chai ve'aseh, so what are your possibilities? And basically they're going to plug in a bunch of possibilities and say, it doesn't make sense that this is a simple reading of that pasuk. Why? Ishtehen mitzriya. Let's say both, it's okay. Now remember the situation. There's a guy who has two wives, and they're each, now this is the assumption you have to assume here in the argument, which is, just like we said that when Rabbi Yeshivav disagrees with Rabbi Simai, if there's a disagreement, usually it's disagreeing on 1 point and not on 10 points, right? It's a minor disagreement usually. They agree about everything else, just one thing off. So likewise here, if you're going to have a beloved wife and a hated wife, we're going to assume they're both similar. It's just there's something different about one and the other. So if you're going to go and say it was an Egyptian convert, and that's why it's chai ve'aseh, that's what we're trying to plug in here. The chai ve'aseh doesn't make so much sense. So option number one would be to say, well, there's two wives and they're both probably similar. So if one's Egyptian, the other one's probably Egyptian also. Well, that can't possibly be, because then shtehen snuot. If they're both Egyptian converts of first generation or second generation, then they're both going to be snuot. And obviously we need a case of one is an okay marriage and one is not an okay marriage. So that obviously doesn't work. And now it's a little bit of a weird havamina, but you'll see why they got to this. Now, that would be the more obvious, right? It would be weird to say they're both Egyptian, but you'll see in a second why they originally wanted to say that. If you're going to say one is Jewish, one is born Jewish, and one is an Egyptian convert, it says, Ki tiyena leish shtei nashim. Shtei nashim sounds like, just like we have the two seirim on Yom Kippur, and the two seirim are always, they have to be identical. You know, the assumption is these two women must be very similar. So, and the only difference between them is that one is forbidden and one is permitted. But what does it mean similar? They have to be from the same nation at least, right? It would be weird to say, Shtei nashim, right? It would be two Jewish women. One is his sister and one is, not his sister or something. It would have to be something where you're at least similar in some way. If one's an Egyptian convert and one's a Jewish woman, they're coming from two totally different nations. That can't possibly be what the pasuk is referring to. Now we have a bigger problem. If she was a woman who's not a virgin anymore, and she married a Kohen Gadol, well, what does the pasuk say? Ki tiyena leish. It says when a man sounds like any man, and this is obviously only a particular man. Miktiv tiyena lekohen. It doesn't say a woman who marries a Kohen. If it was only the case of a be'ula Kohen Gadol, it should have said to a Kohen Gadol. So that doesn't really fit with the pasuk either. So basically, the rabbis said we assume this time a chai ve'aseh because it would have to be something where you could have two women from the same nation, where you would have, it would be any man and not just a Kohen Gadol. So the pasuk is very hard to really read the simple reading of the pasuk with the examples that we explained that are possible that Rabbi Akiva was referring to. So obviously we're going to have to go back to Rabbi Akiva. For Rabbi Akiva, well, ba'al korcha shivka shavke l'krada hai dache umo ke'anavshe. He said, Rabbi Akiva says, look, again, it's the Gemara talking according to Rabbi Akiva. He had no choice. If Rabbi Akiva holds that ain't Kiddushin Tovsim b'chai v'lavim, then there's only one way to, right? There's only, well, we said a few possible ways, but even though they're difficult ways to read the pasuk, and it's not really the simple reading, Rabbi Akiva had no choice. because that was what he held. So it might not be the best reading of the pasuk, but you could squish it into reading the pasuk. You could sort of say, well, yeah, one is Mitzri, one is Jewish. Why do you assume they're all from the same nation? It could be they're more different than you thought. Or it could be it was talking about a Kohen, even though it called him an Ish. Okay, so it's he says, I have no choice. Again, he didn't say this. The Gemara says he had no choice because of his opinion. So let's just summarize this section. We finished up now this section of Kol she'ein aleh kiddushin, meaning all the arayot, there's no kiddushin are valid, and therefore the kid's going to be a mamzer. How do we know there's no kiddushin? Two possibilities of learning it from a chodisha. One was logical, one was based on a pasuk, right? Even though, right, first we learned both the chodisha from two pasukim. From there, we said, let's take logically, we can apply it to everything else that we rejected. Then we said, let's take it from this pasuk that connects them all. We said that it had a bit of a weakness, even though we resolved the weakness, that theoretically you could have learned it all from the nidda, where there we know there is kiddushin. So in the end, you could have accepted that anyway, because better to go l'chumra, stringent, than lenient. But then we moved to Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, who says we learn it from the yevama. Then we said, if you learn it from the yevama, well, why don't we learn all chayve lavim? And then we said, because of the pasuk kitiena. And then we just brought up, well, Rabbi Akiva, who actually thinks all chayve lavim aren't kiddushin tovsim, how can he explain kitiena? And we gave a few possible ways. And then we just went back to say, why didn't the rabbis hold by his reading? Because it's not really a great reading of the pasuk. But Rabbi Akiva has no choice. The rabbis who had a choice, read it differently. Okay, moving on to the last section of our mission. Then we have the last case, which was if nobody can do Kiddushin with them, like a shivcha Canaanite who's not allowed to marry a Jewish man, or a Gentile woman who's not allowed to marry a Jewish man. So what do we learn? Two things. Number one, ein Kiddushin tovsim, right? There is no valid betrothal here. Number two, right? So an intermarriage, for example, is not considered a betrothal by Torah law, or marriage by Torah law. And the second thing is the child goes by the mother. So if the mother's not Jewish, the child's not Jewish, right? This is why many couples, if they do intermarry, the woman converts so that the child will be Jewish. So it follows the mother. So now they want to understand, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Kra. So they want to know, Shivcha Canaanite Minalam. We're now going to have two questions for each one. Number one, how do we know there's no valid Kiddushin? Number two, how do we know that the child is going to follow the mother here, and the child will be, in this case, not Jewish? Okay, so in the maidservant, right, the slave, so the child will be a slave. In the Gentile woman, the child will be just not Jewish. Amar Rav Huna, Amar Kra. So now there's a pasuk we've seen many times, even though it's a quite unpleasant drasha. Shvu lachem po machamor, in Akedat Yitzchak, what does Abraham tell his slaves? Sit here with the donkey, and they darshan this word im as okay, because it can be read as both ways. Hadomei lechamor. They're a nation that's like a chamor, basically meaning they're like animals. Okay, again, we don't say these people are animals, but what they mean is that the rules, the way we view them is they have rules like animals, which is an animal who mates obviously isn't considered betrothed. So there's no laws of betrothal by Canaanite slaves. Okay, so if a Canaanite slave marries a Jew, that's not a marriage. Again, it's always tough to read that source, but that source just is, and we have to kind of deal with it. Okay, so I get now the Gemara says that there's no Kiddushin. Moving now to Amud Bet. But how do you know that the Vlad goes by the mother? So very simply, although we'll come back to this and reject it later, very simply, which means, if you remember, this is when it talks about an Eved Ivri. If you remember, a Jewish slave, a Jew who gets sold in slavery, is allowed, the master is allowed to mate him with a shivcha Canaanite in his domain, right? Someone in his property. He can mate him with that woman, but when the slave leaves after 6 years, he leaves without the children, because the children, it says here, the woman and the children are with the master still. That shows you very clearly the shivcha Canaanite's children are shvachot, right? Or slaves. They're abadim or shvachot. They go by her, not by him. So we basically very simply gave an answer to our questions for shivcha Canaanite. Number one, am hadomeh lechamor, right, from that pasuk. No kiddushin by chamorim, also by donkeys, also no kiddushin by slave, by Gentile, Canaanite slaves. Also that the child follows the mother because it's very clear. Nochrit minala. How do we get a non-Jewish woman? So first we have to say, how do we get that ein kiddushin tovsim? The it's not a valid marriage. A Jewish man marries a non-Jewish woman. That's not considered betrothal. Amarkra lo titchatem. Okay, the pasuk says don't marry them. Okay, which is basically saying don't marry, meaning if you do marry, it's not considered marriage. Okay, this is a bit of a weird pasuk, and Rashi, right? Rashi says it's very clear. Lo tehebam torat chitun. In the second line, and the Rashi's here, it says lo titchatem bam, lo tehebam torat chitun. There is no chitun when it comes to marrying. Okay, Tosfot has a bit of a problem with this because he says this pasuk is difficult that Rashi brings, or the Gemara brings, lo titchatem bam, because haikra, I'm looking in the fourth line of Tosfot, amakra lo titchatem bam, sharei haikra lo mayri b'ovdei kochavim, deha gabe shiv'a amamim hu dichtiv. This pasuk is only for the 7 nations when you get into the land. And therefore you can't say we learn from here. Now the Gemara is going to ask this question later on also. But also there's an issue that says that this is when they convert, you can't marry them. And we're trying to have a pasuk that shows not when they convert. Okay. So Tosfot says, or Rabbeinu Tam says, if you look a few lines down, Lachem perish Rabbeinu Tam, the Gemara demaite kra lo titchaten hare kemo v'gomer. What does that mean? He means that often the Gemara does this. They quote the pasuk, but they really mean the continuation of the pasuk, not that part of the pasuk. They quote the beginning part. But what they really meant was the continuation. It's not learned from the word lo titchaten bam. It's learned from the end of the pasuk. It says, bitcha lo titen lebeno, don't give your daughters to their sons, and bito lo tikach lebanecha, your daughter you shouldn't give to his son, okay, to the Gentile. So now what does it say? Notice what word is used here. Your daughter don't give, lo tikach. Lo tikach is lashon kiddushin. So now it learns from here that there is no likuchin if you did this, okay? Lo tikach, just like lo tiyeh eshet hameit chutza li'ish zar by the yevama. Ain't Kiddushin tosin, because it says don't bring. So there's a big machlok at Rashi Tosfot where it's actually learned from. Okay, but either way, it's learned from lo titchatem bam, or perhaps the continuation there, bitcha lo tikach lebeno. Okay, so that taught us Kiddushin. Vlada kimot haminalan. Where do we get that the child's going to follow the mother? Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai da'amar kra ki yasir et bincha me'achara. Okay, this is going to be a bit of a complicated proof, so bear with me. You have to know some grammar to get this. The pasuk says, don't marry your son to his daughter and don't marry your daughter to his son. Okay, meaning, right, either your male or female children don't marry two Gentiles, because, now pay close attention, Yasir is masculine. He will turn bincha, your son, from me. So that means he will turn your son, meaning he also, meaning a male will turn your male. Now that doesn't make any sense. It would either be the female, ki tasir et bincha, if you marry your son to a Gentile, she will turn you away from God, right? She will turn your son away from God. Or ki yasir would be masculine, but et bitcha, right? The male will turn your female to, right, have her turn away from God. So either way, the male and the male here doesn't work. It's not a male turning away a male. It would be a male turning away a female, or a female turning away a male. And basically the concept is don't marry them because they'll turn you away from God. So what's the bincha? Bincha makes no sense. So therefore they say, what's bincha? They're talking to a man who marries off a child, either male or female, to a Gentile. What it's saying is, what it means is if you marry, what son are we talking about? We need a male to turn your son away. What kind of male would that be? A male who marries your daughter, okay, who's a Yisraelite, and then has a son. The father of that son will turn away the son, meaning the son is really your grandson. So ki yasir, your son-in-law, right, who is this Gentile man, will end up turning away your grandson. That's what the pasuk must mean. Bincha haba mi Yisraelit. Okay, so I'm about a son that comes from your daughter who's Jewish. So now notice what the Torah calls it, your son. So what do you see from here? A son who comes from a Jewish woman, even though she's married to a Gentile man, karoi bincha. It's saying he's your son still. Okay, he's Jewish. But ein bincha haba min haovedet kochavim karoi bincha. But the reverse of that, or the inverse of that, is your son who comes from a Gentile woman will not be called your son. We're only calling him your son. Notice it doesn't say, right, ki tasir et bincha me'acharai, which would mean the female Gentile woman is going to turn your grandson away. Then it would mean that. So basically what they're saying is he's called your son if the mother of that child is Jewish. But if the mother's not Jewish, he won't even be called your son. That's the drasha. Ela bina. It's called her son, and therefore he's not even mentioned in the pasuk. So from there, they learn that the child of this Gentile woman will be a Gentile. Amar Ravina. So Ravina says, Shma mina. You can infer from when he's basically saying the same thing. The ben bika, the son of your daughter, haba min haovei kochavim karoi bincha. Okay, he's called your son. If it comes from, right, your daughter married a Gentile man, the child is still considered within your family. To which they say, Nema kasavar Ravina haovei kochavim ve'eved haba bat Yisrael havlav mamzer. Is Ravina saying then, if this is called your son, maybe it's a mamzer son, because you're not allowed to marry a Gentile. So if she marries a Gentile, maybe the son is a mamzer. To which they say, and this is a very big, critical, important line, especially nowadays, Nehide kasher lo have, mamzer lo have. Okay, it might not be a kosher son, but it's also not a mamzer. And pasul mikre, he's called pasul. Okay, now until now, we've been talking about two different categories. There's kasher and there's mamzer. Okay, either the vlad is kasher or the vlad is mamzer. We've seen many sugyot where they talk in this language. This sugya says, well, don't think, and in fact, there was an opinion that holds this way, but don't think this sugya says that a Jewish woman who marries a Gentile, okay, if the mother's not Jewish, well, the child's just not Jewish. There's no mamzeru by non-Jewish children. But if the child's Jewish, but she married a Gentile, don't think the child's a mamzer. Child's not exactly kosher, but not exactly a mamzer. We're going to call him pasul. This is very important because what does pasul mean? So Rashi says, pasul means, okay, anyone born from some forbidden relationship, there aren't a mamzer. Okay, it's just not a good thing. Okay, but it doesn't have any change in status really. But many of the Rishonim say, no. Pasul, and this is a term we've seen in other places, pasul means can't marry a Kohen. Now, why is this so relevant? Because there's a lot more intermarriage nowadays than there used to be. And back then, when there used to be intermarriage, usually people would intermarry and then kind of leave religion. So they weren't really, or certainly they weren't part of the Orthodox culture of, all the requirements for who one can marry. So if, let's say, someone was a child of an intermarriage and wanted to marry a Kohen, they probably weren't going to a rabbinic court to get married, and therefore they would just get married to a Kohen, and nobody was stopping them because they weren't even doing it in a halachic manner. But nowadays, because of, let's say in Israel, for example, everything is centralized, and if you want to get married and you're Jewish, you have to get married through the Rabbanit. And someone who's born from, in other words, we're talking about a child born from a Gentile with a Jewish woman, which happens quite often, and they have a child. That child, according to many of the Rishonim and according to the way we paskin actually, is not allowed to marry a Kohen. So if someone like that comes to the court and they're about to get married, and then they say, but wait, your father was not Jewish, you can't marry a Kohen. So because there's this big deliberation about whether pasul really means this, or it's just simply like Rashi said, it's just not a good thing, but we're not going to disqualify you from anything. So they say that b'diavad, if you're already married, well, let it go. And then my husband was telling me that he's had a bunch of cases where the court allowed it to go through when they were already living together, because that already considers a b'diavad situation. So if they've already been living together, and as if they're married, just not married technically, then often they will allow it to go through, okay? Or if they've already, like the whole question is what you call b'diavad, where do you put that on the scale? And sometimes there's a willingness to allow cases like this to go through for that. But this is a very, very relevant sugya for many situations where there's an intermarried family, the child is Jewish, but has a father who wasn't Jewish, and then it creates these problems. Okay, so, and then it's a big debate whether he's pasul l'kun, the child. So again, it would only be if it's a woman, can't marry a Kohen, right, if the child's a woman or not. Okay, that's the big understanding, how to understand this sentence, pasul mikre, there's two words. That's the first explanation for, again, nochrit, how do we know she can't marry? Because lo titchatein bam, or maybe bito lo tikach lebenecha, and bito lo, and then ki asir bincha is going to be the explanation for how we know that that the child goes after the mother. Now, the Gemara is going to say, wait a minute. That whole section was all about the 7 nations. It wasn't about all Gentiles. So that's very nice. It explains about the 7 nations that were living in the land. This would all be true. Shar ha'umot minalan, where are we going to get all the other nations? Amar kra ki asirat bincha l'rabot kol hamesirim. Well, notice the pasuk said, don't marry them, which is really for the 7 nations. Why? Because they'll turn your son away from religion. Now, which was your grandson. Now, who's going to turn your son away from religion? Not just the 7 nations, but anyone who doesn't believe in God is going to possibly turn your son away. So therefore, you understand that's the reason which Torah told you. So it's going to include anyone who might turn your child away. And therefore, it's going to include all the other nations, to which they say, Hani chalerish lakish. De Rabbi Shimon. Le Rabbi Shimon de darish tama de ka. That works for Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Shimon was of the approach that we can, Rabbi Shimon the Tana. Sorry, I accidentally said Rish Lakish. I was just glanced down and I saw derivation, and then I was thinking Rish Lakish. But anyway, we're talking about Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon holds that you can darshan reasons of the Torah. Torah gave a reason, so you can go farther with that. Okay, wherever the reason applies, the Torah is going to apply. But the Rabbanan who don't say you can do that, and the Torah just was talking about the 7 nations. So my time, how can you explain? To which we're going to bring a whole different explanation then, because we're going to reject. At least explanation number 1 isn't going to work if you're not willing to take Talmud to Kra, because it's only the 7 nations. How are we going to know everyone else that this is true for? Amar Kra, in the Eshet Yefator, remember you see a woman when you're out of battle from the other nation, you can't just have, marry her, you have, or rape her, God forbid, but there's a whole process you have to go through, and then she kind of becomes Jewish, and then you can be with her. So now they say, Achar kein tavo alei uvalta v'gomer, michlal d'mi'ikara lo tafsa b'kiddushin. Unless you go through this process, you can't just, if you would marry her, it wouldn't work, okay? Basically saying from here, you can learn only at the end of the whole process, so you're allowed to do that. Till then, it wouldn't really work. Okay, so we get that. What about the second part? And how do we know that the child follows? And by the way, Torah is any nation. It wasn't just the 7 nations. It actually isn't at all the 7 nations. But anyway, back to this pasuk where we talked about there was Kiddushin, right? Now, but that is not what we're doing with it right now. It said, and then it says, at the end of that verse, it says, right, and then it says, and he had children. Now, Yaldulo means to him. So, when there is Kiddushin, Krina be Yaldulo, then the sons will be his. But but when there is no Kiddushin, Lo Karina be Yaldulo. And then that refers to this Gentile woman, where if you marry a Gentile woman, there's no Kiddushin Tofsim. So then it's not going to be V'yaldulo, it'll be V'yaldula. They'll be her children and not his children. So that's how we get that the children follow her. To which the Gemara now says, and we'll finish with this, well, then we can use this as proof for the Shivcha also. The Shivcha, if you remember, we said, but now we have a better proof. This is just in general. If Ein Kiddushin Tofsim, and we just proved that a Shivcha Ein Kiddushin Tofsim, because she's like the Chamor, and the Chamor doesn't have Kiddushin, she also doesn't. So therefore, the children would follow her and not him, from V'yaldulo and not V'yaldula. So why don't we say the Shivcha also? This would work for it, to which the Gemara says, in Achinami, you're right. And that's why in the chart, if you look at the chart, in the Shivcha Canaanite, there's 2 proofs. One is Ha'isha v'yaladet yaladuna, but the second is really, which basically undoes the first, is Kitiana li'ish v'yaldulo. Only if there's Havaya, do the kids follow him. Otherwise, if there's no Kiddushin, the kids follow her. So they say, in which case, and I'll leave you with this question, answer this starting in tomorrow's class, which is, so then what do you need this pasuk? The woman and the children go to the master, right? You don't need that pasuk. It's obvious the children go to the master, because Yaldulo is only if there's Kiddushin. When there's no Kiddushin with the Shivcha, then the children follow the mother, and therefore you don't need that pasuk. So what are we going to do with that pasuk? So that's where we're going to start in tomorrow's daf. So again, what we did in the second part of this daf was come up with basically the source for, which we had 2 sources in almost every of these parts except for the first one, which is how do we know Ein Kiddushin Tofsim by a Shivcha and by a non-Jewish woman? And how do we know that the child follows the mother and not the father? And for that, we had 2 basic sources in each case for how we know that to be. That's it for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and peace in general for what's going on. Hopefully good news to come in the next, I don't know how long it will take, but wishing everybody a restful Shabbat and a peaceful Shabbat.